The early life of Lao Tzu is shrouded in mystery, wrapped in legend as much as in historical speculation. Traditional accounts place his birth in the Zhou dynasty period, often cited around the 6th century BCE, though some scholars argue he may have lived during the 4th century BCE. His birthplace is commonly identified as Chu, a region known for its rich spiritual environment and shamanic traditions, which may have influenced his later philosophical outlook. According to ancient narratives, even his birth carried a mythic quality. It is said he was born with white hair and the appearance of an old sage, as if wisdom had accompanied him into the world fully formed. This symbolic origin reflects a cultural belief that Lao Tzu was not merely a thinker, but a timeless voice of the Tao itself. Lao Tzu's family background is believed to have been scholarly, possibly tied to minor aristocracy or administrative service within the Zhou bureaucracy. This would explain his later position in the royal archives, where he worked as a keeper of records, a role that exposed him to a vast spectrum of history, governance, and cultural memory. In the world of ancient China, where written knowledge was power, such a position offered him intimate access to documents on rituals, politics, and the moral failures of rulers. Witnessing the decline of Zhou authority, the rise of competing states, and the erosion of ancient values likely shaped his skepticism toward rigid laws and ambitious governance. Instead of striving for control, he imagined a world where harmony flowed naturally, like water finding its course. His philosophical identity emerged from this environment of turmoil and transition. While Confucius sought order through moral codes and social roles, Lao Tzu suggested that the most balanced life was one aligned with the Tao, the effortless way of nature. These ideas did not suddenly appear. Rather, they were the result of a lifetime observing how force creates resistance, how desire breeds conflict, and how power collapses under its own weight. His origins, therefore, are not defined merely by birthplace or lineage, but by his intellectual inheritance, a witness to the suffering of a civilization struggling against itself. From these roots grew the foundational ideas of Taoism: simplicity, humility, stillness, and the belief that greatness begins with yielding. Legends tell that Lao Tzu eventually left society, traveling west toward the frontier on a water buffalo, feeling that the world was no longer ready or willing to hear his wisdom. Before he departed, he was asked to record his teachings, leading to the creation of the Tao Te Ching, a brief yet endless text that reflects the distilled essence of his thought. His origins, therefore, serve not only as historical background, but as a symbolic prologue. Born into a fading dynasty, nurtured by tradition, yet disillusioned by worldly ambition, Lao Tzu became the voice of the natural world against the noise of human striving. His birth and early life remain half real, half myth, but through that myth, China found one of its most enduring philosophical foundations. Lao Tzu's formative years unfolded in the atmosphere of the Eastern Zhou period, a time marked by intellectual upheaval, political fragmentation, and cultural transformation. This era, beginning after the weakening of central Zhou authority, saw the rise of independent states vying for dominance. Young Lao Tzu would have grown up witnessing the gradual loss of ritual coherence, the erosion of royal power, and the shift from hereditary nobility to competitive bureaucratic governance. Court debates, regional conflicts, and the rapid spread of new political strategies filled the world around him. These events did not simply provide context for his life, but shaped the channels through which his mind developed. He observed not only the external decay of tradition, but also the ongoing search for a new basis of social order. And these impressions eventually wove themselves into the internal threads of his thought. Daily life in the Eastern Zhou was intellectually vibrant despite the turmoil. Scholars traveled from state to state offering counsel, philosophies were exchanged in market towns, and rulers invited thinkers to advise on matters of war, law, and ritual. In this environment, Lao Tzu would have benefited from exposure to many competing ideas, some emphasizing strict governance, others promoting ritual discipline, and others still pursuing wealth and expansion. Instead of aligning himself with any one school, he quietly absorbed their assumptions, questioned their aspirations, and gradually turned toward introspection. The contrast between ambitious ministers and the fragile peace of the countryside left a deep mark on him. It was not force or regulation that impressed him, but rather the resilience of simple people living in rhythm with land and season. The intellectual climate was also enriched by advances in literature, record-keeping, and philosophical debate. Bronze inscriptions, early texts, and oral teachings circulated widely, and as Lao Tzu matured, he entered a world where knowledge became its own form of power. Yet, unlike many contemporaries who pursued mastery of rites or argument, he began to value what could not be catalogued: silence, stillness, the void that precedes thought itself. This tendency toward reflection may have been nurtured by his environment: mountains, rivers, slow agricultural cycles, and the serenity of rural landscapes stood in stark contrast to the tensions of noble courts. While others argued over how to rule the world, he lingered in the rhythms that existed beyond policy and ambition, discovering truths not in command, but in observation. The Eastern Zhou period was therefore not merely a backdrop, but the crucible that shaped Lao Tzu's inner world. Its instability pushed him to question authority, its intellectual richness encouraged broad learning, and its contradictions awakened in him a desire for a different path. One based on harmony rather than conquest, softness rather than dominance, withdrawal rather than display. In witnessing the rise of powerful states and the fall of old certainties, he began to perceive a pattern. Strength exhausts itself, desire corrupts intention, and forced order collapses under its own weight. From the tensions of this age emerged a thinker who sought balance where others sought control. His early life was not defined by grand events, but by quiet perception. Perception that would eventually transform into one of the most influential philosophies in human history. Lao Tzu's family background has long been layered with uncertainty, but traditional accounts present him as a child born into a household with access to literacy, administrative skills, and cultural refinement. Rather than emerging from the rough social margins, he appears to have grown up in an environment where written records, ritual knowledge, and ancestral learning held high value. Although concrete evidence is scarce, later historians describe his lineage as modestly noble, or at least closely tied to the scholarly class who served in government or archival roles. This suggests that from childhood he lived among scrolls, officials, and intellectual discussion, conditions that nurtured reflection and sharpened his awareness of how society functioned at both the village and court levels. His early childhood was likely shaped by the rhythms of rural life paired with the expectations of formal education. He would have learned reading and calligraphy at a young age, not merely as a technical skill, but as a doorway into historical memory and ethical tradition. Unlike the urban aristocrats consumed by competition, provincial scholars often moved between agricultural responsibility and scholarly duty, giving children like Lao Tzu both grounded simplicity and scholarly vision. Seasonal farming, ancestral rites, village festivals, and quiet evenings of study may have coexisted seamlessly during his youth, creating a balance between nature and learning that later resonated through his philosophy. Within the household, elders probably played a central role in shaping his early worldview. Wisdom in ancient China was transmitted not only through texts, but also through stories told by parents, grandparents, and traveling scholars invited for conversation. These voices carried lessons about dynastic rise and fall, the virtues of restraint, and the fragility of human ambition, concepts that would later reappear in the foundational teachings attributed to him. As a child listening to such narratives, Lao Tzu may have absorbed moral lessons not through rigid instruction, but through patient observation of life's subtleties. How small acts create harmony, how excessive desire breeds tension, and how families endure through cooperation rather than dominance. His childhood likely cultivated a temperament of contemplation more than competition. While other young men sought advancement through political service or martial skill, Lao Tzu is characterized in later tradition as quiet, inward-looking, and attentive to natural processes. He may have spent long hours observing animals, weather, and the silent power of growth, experiences that taught him that the world doesn't need command to function. This inner disposition, shaped gently across his upbringing, prepared him for the later realization that the greatest truths are soft, unspoken, and discovered in the spaces between ambition and surrender. Thus, his family background and childhood do not merely describe where he came from. They illuminate the soil from which Taoist insight first emerged. Lao Tzu's rise to the position of imperial archivist placed him at the administrative heart of a Zhou court, where written knowledge was guarded as carefully as ritual treasures. The archives were not simply a storeroom of bamboo strips and silk manuscripts. They formed the memory center of the state. To work there meant handling treaties, ancestral edicts, legal statutes, astronomical records, and ritual manuals that defined how rulers were supposed to act. Lao Tzu's appointment suggests that he was seen as both trustworthy and capable of handling material that shaped policy and legitimated authority. It also indicates that he possessed a rare combination of technical literacy and moral reliability, for archivists were expected to preserve documents without alteration, guarding against both physical decay and political manipulation. The daily reality of this role would have been exacting. Archivists had to read and recopy fragile texts, verify genealogies, track omens, and maintain chronological order in annals of war, diplomacy, and natural disasters. Lao Tzu would have spent long hours in quiet halls, surrounded by shelves of bound slips, ink, brushes, and seals of authentication. In this environment, patterns hidden across decades and centuries became visible, promises made and broken, alliances formed and shattered, reforms proclaimed and then abandoned. Handling records of past kings and ministers, he could trace how ambition, greed, and overconfidence repeatedly led to decline. This direct encounter with the long-term consequences of human decisions helped crystallize his conviction that calculated control, no matter how refined, almost always slid into imbalance. The archives also exposed him to the contrast between idealized theory and actual practice. Ritual texts described harmonious rule, benevolent government, and rulers who aligned themselves with cosmic order. Military reports and petitions, on the other hand, revealed corruption, desperation, and the constant fear of rebellion. In his role, Lao Tzu saw both sets of documents side by side, the polished language of what should be and the stark accounts of what was. This tension may have deepened his distrust of elaborate doctrines and rigid moralizing. Instead of believing that more laws or finer regulations could save the realm, he began to sense that excess intervention itself was the root of disorder. The more rulers tried to engineer every detail of life, the more unexpected chaos their efforts produced. Serving in the archives also placed Lao Tzu in contact with a wide variety of people. Envoys bringing reports from distant regions, officials requesting old precedents, ritual specialists searching for forgotten formulas, and perhaps even wandering scholars seeking historical references. From this vantage point, he observed that each group approached the same body of records with different motives. Some looked for justification, others for guidance, others for advantage. Over time, he seems to have grown skeptical of this instrumental use of knowledge. To him, the deepest wisdom was not something one mined from documents to strengthen power, but a more subtle awareness of the underlying order of reality, which no file or edict could fully capture. His appointment as imperial archivist thus became more than a career step. It was the setting in which he discovered the limits of history, the hollowness of many political promises, and the superiority of a life that flowed with the unspoken way rather than clinging to the written word. As imperial archivist, Lao Tzu stood at the crossroads of centuries of accumulated learning, where texts from the earliest Zhou kings, ritual masters, historians, and natural philosophers rested together in carefully maintained bundles. Unlike scholars who relied on oral tradition or second-hand accounts, he had direct access to works few others ever saw: forgotten commentaries on governance, records of divination, ancient cosmological diagrams, and ceremonial instructions preserved from ancestral temples. These writings were not merely historical artifacts. They were fragments of a collective human effort to interpret the world. The breadth of sources before him meant his thinking did not grow from a single school or doctrine, but from exposure to the full spectrum of ideas surrounding human order, cosmic balance, and the nature of change. His intellectual formation developed gradually through close reading rather than public debate. Where other thinkers built arguments to persuade rulers or shape policy, Lao Tzu appears to have absorbed knowledge in silence, allowing meaning to settle within him like sediment in still water. The archives offered him lessons not only through what they said, but also through what they could not explain. Many documents recorded successful reformers and powerful kings, yet generations later, those achievements were erased by war, succession crises, or famine. This confrontation with historical impermanence taught him that even the grandest doctrines fade, while the underlying rhythms of nature continue unaffected. Books preserved memory, yes, but they also revealed how temporary human designs truly were. Through study of cosmological and metaphysical texts, Lao Tzu became increasingly attuned to patterns of balance and reversal, the idea that extremes naturally return to their opposite. In some medical treatises, he saw the principle of yin and yang in the body. In agricultural calendars, he recognized that growth requires dormancy. In legal records, he noticed that harsh laws breed resistance. These insights did not come from a single revelation, but from thousands of observations accumulated across years of reading. Slowly, he understood that wisdom lies not in mastering life through force, but in understanding life as a movement of cycles. His philosophy was therefore not an invention formed all at once. It was a distillation of patterns repeated across countless lives recorded in the archives. Over time, the ancient texts shaped Lao Tzu into a thinker who valued depth over brilliance, simplicity over complexity, and inner clarity over external success. The knowledge he encountered did not push him toward ambition, but awakened the belief that genuine understanding emerges only when one stops trying to control the world. His intellectual formation was therefore a process of shedding rather than accumulating. The archives gave him material to observe, reflect on, and ultimately refine into a view that transcended the documents themselves. From this foundation emerged a philosophy not rooted in conquest or technical governance, but in harmony with the unseen order beneath all things, a worldview shaped quietly, patiently, through long companionship with the wisdom of the past. The legendary meeting between Lao Tzu and Confucius stands as one of the most evocative moments in Chinese intellectual history. Not because its details can be verified, but because it symbolizes the encounter of two contrasting visions of wisdom. Confucius, younger and ambitious, sought solutions to social disorder through ritual, ethical cultivation, and hierarchical responsibility. Lao Tzu, older and already weathered by years of archival reflection, viewed society from a quieter distance. Accounts suggest that Confucius approached him to discuss ceremony and moral governance, hoping to draw insight from a man whose reputation for inner clarity had already begun to circulate. The difference in their inquiries was clear from the beginning. Confucius asked how best to guide people. Lao Tzu asked why one must guide them at all. Their dialogue revealed a profound tension between structure and spontaneity. Confucius emphasized the value of proper conduct, ancestral rites, and civic duty, tools he believed necessary to restore decency in a collapsing age. Lao Tzu challenged the very foundation of this approach. He is said to have told Confucius that excessive learning and ritual pride could obscure the natural simplicity of life, turning scholars into performers rather than sages. True wisdom, he suggested, was like water, soft, unpretentious, yet capable of wearing down stone. Confucius, accustomed to clarity through definition, found this elusive reasoning unsettling. The meeting became not a convergence of ideas, but a mirror in which each saw the limits of his own method. Later stories describe Confucius leaving the encounter shaken, even humbled. He reportedly told his disciples that Lao Tzu resembled a dragon, untraceable in movement, beyond grasp, soaring by means unknown. Whether this remark is historically accurate matters less than what it represents. Confucius recognized in Lao Tzu a kind of depth that could not be reached by doctrine or meticulous rule-making. From this interaction, Confucius may have learned restraint in judgment and the danger of intellectual arrogance, while Lao Tzu confirmed his view that elaborate moral systems inevitably trap themselves in their own complexity. Their paths parted, not in hostility, but with mutual acknowledgement of difference. The meeting thus stands not as a clash, but as an axis around which two philosophical worlds turned. Confucian thought grew into a tradition of social order, education, and ethical duty. Taoism emerged as the voice of stillness, yielding, and natural flow. The dialogue between them, real or imagined, became a symbolic moment when China's two great streams of thought met, touched, and diverged. Through that encounter, their philosophies gained sharper definition. Confucius as architect of cultivated society, Lao Tzu as guide to the uncarved block of existence. It is through contrast that each figure gained permanence, and through their brief crossing that Chinese philosophy found balance between discipline and harmony, between effort and effortless being. From his vantage point within the Zhou world, Lao Tzu watched the machinery of rule from both inside and outside, paying close attention to how decisions made at the top filtered down into the lives of ordinary people. He saw that government spoke the language of virtue and order, yet its actions often produced anxiety, hardship, and unrest. When rulers increased taxes to fund armies or palaces, the countryside quietly absorbed the burden through longer working days, hunger, and the sale of land. When new laws were proclaimed in the name of stability, they frequently multiplied fear rather than calm, as people worried more about punishment than justice. These experiences led him to suspect that much of what was called good government was, in practice, a sophisticated way of managing insecurity rather than easing it. Lao Tzu's observations extended to the character of those in power. Ministers and officials frequently spoke of loyalty, righteousness, and benevolence, but their careers depended on competition, flattery, and strategic alliances. He noticed that the more a ruler boasted of virtue, the more his court seemed filled with intrigue and rivalry. This gap between language and reality became a central lesson. When leaders constantly advertise morality, it is often because genuine trust has already eroded. For Lao Tzu, a truly balanced ruler did not need to proclaim goodness. His restraint, modesty, and quiet decision-making would be felt by the people without slogans or grand displays. The louder a government insisted on its own correctness, the more it revealed its inner weakness. At the social level, he observed how hierarchy and ambition shaped everyday relationships. Families were strained when sons left the fields to seek rank at court, chasing promotion and favor instead of tending ancestral land. Villages were disrupted when local leaders imitated the style of distant nobles, erecting impressive buildings while neglecting basic needs. People began to measure one another by rank, wealth, and office, rather than by character. Lao Tzu saw that this constant comparison bred restlessness and envy, turning neighbors into rivals. In his eyes, a healthy society was one in which people were content with simple livelihoods, where prestige mattered less than sufficiency, and where leaders did not encourage endless desire by parading luxury before those who had little. War and security policy made an equally deep impression on him. States justified military campaigns as necessary for defense or honor, but Lao Tzu noticed how each victory seemed to plant the seeds of the next conflict. Conquered territories required garrisons, garrisons demanded resources, and new taxes were then imposed on already strained populations. Soldiers returned from campaigns hardened and traumatized, bringing violence and disillusionment back into civilian life. From these cycles, he drew the conclusion that aggressive strategies, even when carefully planned, inevitably produced outcomes that no one could fully control. Instead of glorifying conquest, he emphasized minimal interference, light taxation, and non-provocative behavior. Believing that a state that did not push its neighbors or its own people too hard would paradoxically be the most secure. Over years of watching these patterns repeat, Lao Tzu came to view government not as a tool to perfect society, but as a force that must learn to limit itself. He did not deny the need for leadership, but he argued that the best leadership was almost invisible. Laws few and clear, punishments rare, wealth modest, expectations simple. Society, he believed, possessed its own natural capacity for balance when not constantly stirred by fear and desire from above. His observations on government and society therefore moved in a different direction from many reformers of his time. Rather than asking how rulers could exert more effective control, he asked how they could refrain from needless interference, allowing human communities to find equilibrium in the same way that forests, rivers, and seasons do, through quiet adjustment rather than constant command. Lao Tzu's disillusionment did not come suddenly or through a single dramatic event. It formed slowly, like a weight added grain by grain. Working in the administrative core of the Zhou bureaucracy, he had a clear view of how decisions were made, who influenced them, and what motives lay beneath the polished language of statecraft. There was a growing distance between the ideals promoted in official rhetoric, virtue, benevolence, righteousness, and the reality that ruled internal court behavior. Policies were shaped not by the welfare of the people, but by the shifting interests of nobles, ministers, military commanders, and wealthy lineage groups. Lao Tzu watched promises of reform dissolve into negotiation, watched justice bend to bloodline and favor, and witnessed how intellectual brilliance often served ambition rather than wisdom. With each passing year, his trust in political systems drained away. He became especially troubled by the subtle competition that defined court life. Alliances formed and broke like seasonal winds. Courtiers changed loyalty depending on advantage, and even those who spoke sincerely were forced into tactical maneuvering to survive. Merit mattered less than patronage. Honesty was risky, while eloquence without integrity was rewarded. The thirst for recognition shaped conversations, gestures, and even expressions. Lao Tzu observed how men who claimed to serve the realm were in fact navigating the fragile geometry of power, seeking proximity to influence rather than truth. To live in such a world required constant self-awareness and caution, a condition he found spiritually corrosive. Where others adapted, he felt the desire to withdraw. Another source of disillusionment came from the cyclical nature of political failure. A minister would rise with plans to restore order, only to be dismissed when his methods angered the wrong faction. A ruler would announce new moral legislation, yet corruption would return unchanged beneath a fresh vocabulary. Court philosophers argued endlessly over how to perfect society, but none noticed that the arguments themselves reflected the same ego-driven impulses that fueled instability. Lao Tzu recognized a deeper pattern. Systems built on ambition inevitably generate conflict, no matter how refined their structure. Even well-intentioned reformers fell into the trap of believing that stronger laws and more intricate administration could cure social disorder, when in truth, such complexity made disorder multiply. As his disappointment grew, silence became his response. Instead of advocating policies or offering grand advice, he retreated into observation and inward clarity. The court valued cleverness, calculation, and display. Lao Tzu valued simplicity, restraint, and the quiet intelligence of nature. He began to see withdrawal not as weakness, but as a form of resistance, an affirmation that some truths cannot survive within the noise of competition. His eventual departure from the political world was therefore not an escape from responsibility, but the final expression of his insight that a life lived under the pressure of courtly ambition distorts human spirit, while a life aligned with the Tao restores balance, humility, and peace. His disillusionment became the threshold through which philosophical understanding turned into lived principle, guiding him toward the path that would define his legacy. Lao Tzu's departure from the Zhou capital is remembered as a quiet turning point, both in his life and in the symbolic imagination of later generations. After years spent within the orbit of officialdom, he chose not to fight for influence, reform institutions, or gather students around him, but instead to step away entirely from the center of power. The capital, with its palaces, ritual complexes, and crowded offices, represented an exhausted order, an old dynasty drifting toward fragmentation. Lao Tzu's decision to leave can be seen as a final acknowledgement that the structures he had observed for so long were beyond gentle correction. Rather than lending his wisdom to a machine he believed could no longer be guided, he chose to remove his presence altogether, letting the court continue its course without his counsel or silent witness. Later tradition describes his departure not as a dramatic exile, but as an almost invisible withdrawal. There were no proclamations, no public disputes, no open break with rulers or ministers. Instead, he is imagined packing his few belongings, mounting an ox or water buffalo, and riding slowly westward along dusty roads used by merchants, soldiers, and messengers. This image captured the hearts of later Taoist thinkers. A sage turning his back on the glitter of rank and ceremony, facing instead the long, unmarked path beyond the frontier. The journey itself carried meaning. Moving away from the capital meant passing from an artificial world, built on titles, rules, and display, into landscapes where mountains, rivers, and open skies paid no attention to human hierarchies. As he traveled, Lao Tzu would have passed through market towns, farming villages, and patrol stations along the border routes. Here he could see forms of life that had little place in court debates, communities surviving on modest harvests, traders risking long distances, guards enduring isolation and danger without the comforts of noble living. These encounters likely confirmed his sense that the true fabric of society lay far from the places where edicts were drafted. Ordinary people desired stability, food, and peace more than grand visions of order crafted in the capital. By physically moving away from the Zhou center, he was also inwardly shifting his attention from theories of governance to the immediate realities of existence: weather, hunger, shelter, and the quiet resilience of those who had never seen a royal palace. The most famous moment linked to this departure is the story of his arrival at a western border pass, where a keeper, often named Yin Shi, recognized in him an unusual presence. Sensing that this old traveler carried a lifetime of insight, the gatekeeper is said to have begged him not to vanish into obscurity without leaving a trace of his understanding. In response, Lao Tzu paused on his journey and wrote down a short work of concentrated reflections on the way and its expression in the world. Only after this act of condensation did he continue his path beyond the passes, disappearing from historical view. Whether legend or not, the story suggests that his departure from the Zhou capital was not an escape born of bitterness, but a deliberate movement toward anonymity, in which teaching was given once, briefly, and without ownership, before the teacher himself dissolved into the vastness beyond the borders. In this way, his leaving became a teaching in itself. By refusing to cling to office, reputation, or even a visible school of followers, Lao Tzu embodied the very principles later associated with his name: non-assertion, humility, and the willingness to yield rather than contend. The capital kept its ceremonies, factions, and official histories. He chose the unrecorded road, trusting that the way did not need monuments to endure. The departure from the Zhou capital thus stands as more than a biographical episode. It marks the moment when a man who had seen the limits of human rule committed himself fully to a life aligned with something larger than any dynasty. A path traced not in stone or bronze, but in the transient dust of a road leading into silence. Lao Tzu's journey westward marked the culmination of a lifetime spent watching the ambitions of men rise and collapse. Leaving behind the cultured but troubled heart of the Zhou world, he traveled towards the frontier, a direction heavy with symbolism in Chinese thought. The West signified the edge of civilization, where fields transitioned into open plains and where the influence of royal authority faded into distant rumor. By choosing this path, Lao Tzu stepped out of the administrative rhythm that had shaped his earlier years and moved into a landscape governed by wind, soil, and the slow turning of seasons. He did not travel with entourage or escort. Tradition paints him as a solitary figure, moving patiently through dusty roads, a man unburdened by the weight of titles or possessions. With each mile, the noise of politics softened, replaced by the unlabored rhythm of hooves and wind. This slow approach to the frontier gave him time to observe lives shaped not by decree, but by necessity. In villages, he encountered farmers who rose with dawn and rested with dusk, unaffected by philosophical disputes or ministerial reforms. Traders bargained, soldiers watched the roads, and children played by riverbanks. Daily acts of survival and joy that required no intellectual explanation. These experiences formed the final layer of his transformation. The realization that the way was not confined to scholars or officials, but flowed naturally through ordinary people who lived simply without striving for greatness. The westward road, broad and unmarked, became a living metaphor for the Tao, open to all, yet fully visible only to those who walked without force. Upon reaching the border, Lao Tzu encountered the figure who would ensure that his insights were not lost to time. The keeper of the Western Gate, named Yin Shi in later accounts. Yin Shi, reputed to be a man of unusual intuition and learning, recognized that this quiet traveler was no common wanderer. Some versions of the tale describe how he studied Lao Tzu's demeanor, the calm of his gaze, the aged stillness of his movements, and understood that generations of observation and reflection walked with him. Sensing the impending departure of a profound mind, Yin Shi pleaded that Lao Tzu not vanish beyond the realm of men without leaving something behind. The request wasn't made for glory or reward, but from the fear that great wisdom might dissolve into vastness without ever taking form in words. In response, Lao Tzu agreed to pause and write, not to build a doctrine or school, but as a final act of generosity before entering obscurity. At the border post, he is said to have composed a text of striking brevity and depth. No grand treatise, but a concentrated reflection on the way, its uncarved nature, and the patterns that govern power, desire, and return. This work, remembered as the Tao Te Ching, did not serve as a biography or argument. Instead, it stood like a mirror to the unseen order of the world. After presenting the manuscript to Yin Shi, Lao Tzu continued westward, crossing the frontier into mystery. No reliable account records where he went, whether he joined hermits in high valleys, settled among unknown tribes, or disappeared into mountain silence. His journey ended where history loses sight, and where legend begins. The Border Gate story endures because it captures the essence of his philosophy in action. The sage did not build temples, gather disciples, or seek immortality through monuments. Instead, he passed through the world lightly, leaving behind only a slim book and the memory of an old man on an ox heading toward sunset. The journey to the West was the final expression of the way, departing without ownership, speaking without claiming authority, teaching without remaining to guide. His disappearance beyond the gate is the last teaching. Wisdom does not need to stand in the center to endure. Sometimes it lives longest when it rides quietly into the horizon. The work we now call the Tao Te Ching did not emerge as a conventional book written in one smooth effort for a reading public. It grew out of a lifetime of distillation. Lao Tzu's earlier years among records, rituals, and political documents had filled his mind with examples, stories, and patterns. Yet his instinct was always to reduce, not to expand. By the time he sat down to put brush to bamboo, his aim was not to explain everything he had learned, but to compress what truly mattered into the fewest possible lines. That intention shaped the texture of the text. Instead of long arguments, we find compact verses, paradoxical couplets, and images that seem to hover between poetry and instruction. It is as if he wanted each chapter to act like a seed, small, dry, unassuming, capable of unfolding only in the inner soil of a receptive mind. The composition process, as later tradition imagines it, was driven by urgency but not haste. Lao Tzu was an old man when he finally agreed to write. He had no interest in founding a school or defending a position in debate. He knew his time was short and that words could easily be twisted into tools of power. For that reason, he allowed ambiguity to remain. Instead of listing rules, he crafted lines that bend away from fixed definitions. Terms like Tao, Day, non-action, and softness are never locked into a single meaning. They remain open, shifting slightly depending on the reader's state of mind. This was deliberate. Rather than freezing truth into formulas, he shaped the text so that it could continue to move, adjusting to new situations long after his own life ended. Composition, in this sense, was not just writing. It was the careful construction of a living mirror that would reflect different faces across generations. The structure of the Tao Te Ching also reflects this intention. The divisions we now call chapters or verses are short, often self-contained, yet they echo one another in subtle ways. Themes like humility, return, emptiness, and the dangers of force reappear in different images. A valley, water, an uncarved block, a newborn child, a bent bow. This repetition is not a lack of creativity. It is a method. By circling around the same truths through different metaphors, Lao Tzu allowed the reader to approach understanding from many angles without ever turning insight into a rigid system. In composing the text, he wove a loose net of images rather than building a solid wall of doctrine. The gaps in that net are as important as the strands. What he does not say, or only hints at, invites contemplation more powerfully than a long explanation would. Another striking aspect of its composition is the way it speaks simultaneously to rulers, common people, and solitary seekers. Some passages address those in power, warning them against heavy-handed control, glory-seeking, and moral exhibitionism. Others speak in quiet, intimate tones about personal conduct, how to move gently, how to let go, how not to be broken by the world's hardness. Still others rise above social roles entirely, pointing toward a cosmic rhythm in which all beings appear and disappear. When Lao Tzu gathered these strands, he did not separate them into sections for different audiences. He allowed guidance for the state, advice for everyday life, and reflections on the cosmos to sit side by side. This compositional choice reinforces his core insight. The same way that shapes the stars also shapes a village, a family, and a single breath. Finally, The very brevity of the Tao Te Ching is part of its design. Lao Tzu could have filled scroll after scroll with historical examples, technical terminology, and detailed commentary on other thinkers. Instead, he left behind a work that can be read in a single sitting, yet pondered for a lifetime. Its composition is an act of restraint. Each additional sentence that might have clarified a phrase would also have limited it. By stopping where he did, he entrusted future readers with responsibility. They must supply patience, reflection, and experience. The text will not do the work for them. In this way, the manner in which the Tao Te Ching was composed is itself a lesson. It demonstrates that true teaching does not overwhelm with information. It offers just enough to point the way, and then steps aside, allowing the silent movement of the Tao to complete what words can only begin. This is the heart of Wu Wei, effectiveness that arises from harmony, not from pushing. For Lao Tzu, forced effort arises when ego tries to control everything. When someone insists on imposing their will, they tense up, in speech, in behavior, even in thought. They plan excessively, cling to outcomes, and resist any deviation from their design. This attitude may produce short-term results, but it also generates friction, resentment, exhaustion, unintended consequences. Wu Wei offers the opposite model. Instead of beginning from desire, I must achieve this no matter what, it begins from attentive awareness. What is already happening here? What is ready to grow? What is wise to leave alone? The person who practices Wu Wei is not passive, but responsive. They move at the moment when movement is needed, and they refrain when interference would only complicate matters. Their power lies in timing and sensitivity rather than in intensity. On a personal level, Wu Wei changes the way one approaches problems, goals, and relationships. Rather than trying to dominate every situation, a person shaped by this principle learns to remove unnecessary resistance inside themselves. They stop arguing with reality in their thoughts, which frees energy for clear, simple action. When anger arises, they do not immediately unleash it. They allow it to settle and then choose a response that does not deepen conflict. When a task appears, they handle it in steadily paced steps rather than in anxious bursts. Over time, their life begins to resemble a river that finds its way around rocks instead of trying to crush them. This does not mean that they never struggle, but that even in difficulty, they do not fight more than the situation truly demands. They conserve strength by refusing to dramatize circumstances with extra fear or pride. Lao Tzu also applies Wu Wei to leadership and government. A ruler obsessed with control issues, endless orders, monitors every detail, and uses heavy punishment to keep everyone in line. Such behavior creates a tense atmosphere in which people obey outwardly but resist inwardly, and sooner or later pressure explodes. A leader guided by Wu Wei governs differently. Laws are few and clear, rewards and punishments are moderate, and the ruler does not constantly push themselves into public attention. Because they refrain from micromanaging, people are allowed to organize their own lives more naturally. Paradoxically, less interference brings more stability. The state appears calm, not because everyone is tightly controlled, but because they are not continually provoked. The leader's effortless action lies in making just enough adjustments to prevent harm, and then stepping back, trusting that society, like nature, has its own capacity to balance itself when it is not overworked by authority. Ultimately, Wu Wei is not a special technique, but a way of being that grows out of trust in the Tao. When one believes that the world is fundamentally chaotic and hostile, constant struggle seems necessary. When one senses that there is an underlying pattern of balance, subtle but present, then one dares to relax unnecessary tension and act from a quieter center. Lao Tzu's principle of Wu Wei invites a person to test this trust in small things first, in a conversation, a decision, a moment of conflict. Little by little, they discover that many things resolve more cleanly when they are not forced. From there, Wu Wei expands into a guiding rhythm for life, an art of doing that leaves no scars, a form of strength that does not need to shout. After presenting his teachings to the border guard and leaving behind the short yet immeasurable manuscript of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu stepped into a space where history begins to thin into legend. The final period of his life is not recorded in official chronicles, as if he intended his own existence to dissolve into the very philosophy he taught. Later traditions imagined him traveling farther west into lands beyond the reach of Chinese governance, regions of rugged mountains, deep valleys, and scattered tribes living at nature's tempo rather than under dynastic law. To some, he became a wandering sage, to others a hermit living in a remote grotto, and to others still a teacher whose voice guided small groups of seekers. The absence of factual documentation does not diminish this phase of his life. Instead, it echoes one of his core insights: that true wisdom does not insist on being preserved through names, dates, or monuments. Over time, stories grew around his disappearance like vines around an abandoned gate. Many described him teaching quietly among foreign peoples, not by founding an institution, but by living so simply that his presence itself was instructive. There were tales of him healing disputes in villages without issuing commands, resolving conflicts like a gentle stream smoothing a stone. In these legends, Lao Tzu embodies Wu Wei, the style of influence that works without force, leaving no trace of authorship. Other accounts claim that he reached lands to the west, where he became revered as a sage of almost supernatural insight, though such stories say more about the human need for continuity than about verifiable fact. What remains consistent across all narratives is his refusal to return to politics or courtly life. After witnessing the dangers of ambition, he chose the horizon over the throne room. As generations passed, Lao Tzu's physical absence only strengthened the aura surrounding his name. Unlike Confucius, who left behind disciples, family lines, and a school deeply rooted in public affairs, Lao Tzu offered no lineage to maintain his memory. The Tao Te Ching became his only trace within history, like a footprint that cannot be matched to a body still present. Scholars debated whether he lived to an advanced age, whether he achieved spiritual longevity, or whether he simply blended into the landscape of ordinary life. Some traditions went further, suggesting he never died at all, only shifted into the Tao fully, the way a wave returns to the sea. In this sense, his disappearance was not a vanishing, but a completion. His teachings became inseparable from his life, and his life became inseparable from the principle of natural return. What remains most compelling about the end of Lao Tzu's story is that it resists the desire for closure. Modern readers, accustomed to biography as a chain of verifiable events, may wish for clearer dates, identifiable locations, or archaeological proof. Yet Lao Tzu's withdrawal reinforces precisely what he spent his lifetime conveying: that the greatest truths are not always those that stand visibly in the historical record. His disappearance is a final teaching: to release the need to grasp to allow uncertainty, to honor presence without possession. The sage who valued emptiness ultimately became part of it. His later life lives on not through documented achievements, but through the enduring mystery that invites each generation to seek the Tao for themselves, rather than merely trace the footsteps of the man who pointed toward it. Lao Tzu's legacy began not with a powerful institution or a famous lineage, but with a slim, enigmatic text that quietly reshaped the way Chinese thinkers understood reality, knowledge, and the good life. The Tao Te Ching offered a vision of the world in which spontaneity, softness, and simplicity are not weaknesses to be overcome, but deep strengths aligned with the structure of existence itself. This perspective challenged the dominant assumption that order must be imposed from above through strict ritual, heavy law, or moral preaching. Instead, Lao Tzu suggested that the world already contains a subtle order, and that wisdom consists in aligning with it rather than trying to dominate it. Later philosophers, poets, and officials returned again and again to this idea, using his brief verses as a springboard for discussions about nature, self-cultivation, and the limits of human control. Within the broad current of Chinese thought, Lao Tzu stands at the root of what became known as Taoist philosophy, Daojia. Texts like the Zhuangzi expanded and deepened his insights, turning his concise sayings into rich stories, dialogues, and parables. These later writers took Lao Tzu's hints about yielding, emptiness, and freedom from rigid distinctions and developed them into a sophisticated critique of conventional values. They questioned not only politics, but also language itself, showing how words can trap the mind in artificial divisions. In this way, Lao Tzu's influence moved beyond ethics into epistemology. He inspired a way of thinking that distrusts absolute claims and encourages a playful, flexible relationship with concepts. The early Taoist tradition can be seen as a long conversation with the seeds he planted. At the same time, Lao Tzu's ideas did not exist in isolation from other schools. Confucianism, legalism, and later Buddhist thought all encountered and responded to his vision. Confucian scholars often interpreted the Tao Te Ching through a moral lens, softening its more radical withdrawal from public ambition and reading its call for humility as support for humane governance. Legalist thinkers, though very different in spirit, sometimes borrowed his language of effectiveness and natural tendencies while stripping away its compassion. When Buddhism entered China, its notions of emptiness, non-attachment, and the illusory nature of rigid distinctions found a ready echo in Lao Tzu's teachings. The blending of Buddhist and Taoist insights helped shape Chan, Zen Buddhism, where sudden insight, quiet naturalness, and distrust of elaborate doctrine again reflect Lao Tzu's shadow in the background. His legacy, therefore, is woven into multiple traditions, each emphasizing different facets of his thought. Over the centuries, Lao Tzu also became central to reflections on rulership and public life. Many statesmen and emperors, especially in times of exhaustion and over-centralization, turned to the Tao Te Ching for guidance on how to rule with minimum interference. The ideal of a ruler who leads by example, speaks little, keeps desires modest, and allows people to live simply drew directly from Lao Tzu's counsel. Although actual politics often drifted far from these ideals, his text served as a critical mirror, reminding later generations that aggressive intervention, heavy taxation, and constant mobilization eventually undermine their own goals. Even when governments did not follow his advice, they had to reckon with it, explaining or justifying why they chose control over restraint. In this sense, he functioned as a quiet, persistent critic lodged at the heart of Chinese political imagination. Beyond formal philosophy and statecraft, Lao Tzu's influence seeped into Chinese culture at a more intimate level. Painters, poets, calligraphers, and hermits in the mountains all drew from his imagery of valleys, water, clouds, and the uncarved block. The ideal of retreat into nature, not as an escape from responsibility but as a higher form of clarity, owes much to his outlook. Religious Taoism later embraced him as a divine or semi-divine figure, folding his image into ritual, alchemy, and practices of inner cultivation. Even in those highly developed religious systems, the faint outline of the old sage who valued quiet over display can still be seen. In the end, Lao Tzu's legacy in Chinese philosophy is not just a set of doctrines, but a recurring invitation to step back from noise, to question the obsession with control, and to discover in simplicity and yielding a different kind of strength, one that outlives dynasties and speaks across centuries.